blacks hate blacks. It's not just a myth. Why we do not have the same respect for members of our race as we do for some other race, especially the white race. And that we were told, quite to the contrary, that we were from a land of savages, of cannibals. And except by the grace of God and the white man, we would have been a lost people. So we should be on our knees forever praying and thanking God that we were brought, even in slavery, to this land to escape the horrors of Africa. And this was brought in and drilled into us generation after generation.
Africa, the second largest continent, is an area of almost 12 million square miles in size. It is comprised of 50 independent countries and populated by over 537 million people who speak over 1,000 languages and dialects. For eons, Africa's wealth has been a magnet that has attracted the entire world. The continent has been plundered for its vast mineral and human resources. Traditional historians have viewed this land as one of primitive savages who slept through the millennia, contributing little to the cultural legacy of mankind. The facts, however, tell a different story. Scholars and scientists now concede that Africa is the birthplace of mankind. Africans were the first builders of civilization. They discovered mathematics, invented writing, developed sciences, engineering, medicine, religion, fine arts, and built the Great Pyramids, an architectural achievement which still baffles modern science. What caused the cradle of the world's oldest and greatest civilizations to crumble, leaving in its wake a people who are exploited, oppressed, and economically underprivileged? In a moment, Africa's downfall.
Tony Brown's Journal is brought to you by Pepsi-Cola Company and your local Pepsi bottlers.
Dr. Williams, it's an honor being able to meet with you and to talk with you. You have written what many of us consider to be the definitive work about the culture of Africans throughout the world, and you approach it from the standpoint of the destruction of that civilization. Why did you choose the aspect of destruction rather than some other point of view?
The aspect of destruction was emphasized for the reason that it was quite clear that the black people in America seemed to be generally unaware that they had a history, that they were told that they had achieved nothing. They were told...
This man says the true facts are to be found in a more thorough and honest look at history. After Dr. Chancellor Williams, a native of Bennettsville, South Carolina, received his doctorate in history and sociology, he studied psychology, anthropology, archaeology, and economics. He also taught Arabic history and worked as a professor of history at Howard University for 29 years. He won an award from the Black Academy of Arts and Letters and was the first recipient of the 21st Century Foundation's Clarence L. Holt Prize for Excellence in Literature.
Now, of course, the record was there to show that much of Western civilization was built upon the foundation of the land where civilization itself had begun, and this was in Africa. Therefore, the focus had to be on Africa to see to what extent the recent revelations with the turn of the century, at the turn of the century, that Africa was the cradle of civilization. To what extent could this be actually verified? And so my work was directed in the uncovering much of what had been lost, much of what had been disguised, much of what had been stolen, refurbished, reworked, and presented to Western civilization as the work brought from Africa but present to Western civilization as the creation of Western man.
Dr. Chancellor Williams spent 16 years writing his book, and although a piece of extraordinary research, he considered it a greater miracle that he was able to get it published. Plagued by a chronic lack of funds and turned down by his academic associates and all other sources, Dr. Williams mortgaged his home. Then another obstacle arose. Due to his rapidly failing eyesight, he was forced to abandon his earlier plans for an expanded 3-volume work and had to settle for a condensed version of his research into a single volume, the book we now know as The Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of a Race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD.
What did you find out about ancient African civilizations?
Well, to begin with, I found out that ancient African civilization was, first of all, the beginning of civilization. I found out that there could be no record found anywhere that antedates the advanced civilization of Africa. And this was the finding of European and other scholars. And they were now gradually admitting it, and when the evidence became overwhelming, the question arose, could Africans have achieved all this? Could Africans have achieved this remarkable work in architecture that could be traced back for thousands of years before Christ, before Western civilization had even started? Could Africans have done this? Could Africans have achieved this high advance in mathematics, in physics, in chemistry, in medicine, and so forth? I mean, many of the things we now glorify as modern. Take the Washington Monument, for example, which is an exact duplication of ancient African architecture, which is well known. And most of the columns we see on these stately columns on buildings, which the Greeks, in studying in Africa, are borrowed from the Africans, remodeled them at Doria, at Corinth, and so forth, gave these columns the name of the cities in which they remodeled them, and gave them a Greek character. They really didn't do much changing. They merely removed the Africa and the canthus leaf at the column and modified, but otherwise it was substantially the same as Africa.
Dr. Williams, were there ever laws and rules that governed the entire continent of Africa?
There were laws and rules that governed the entire continent in the same sense that you have the same system of laws and rules that which govern a whole people without the same time having a single government, a single state spreading over a whole continent, the second largest in the world. In other words, I'm saying that while Africa, in contradistinction to being a country, was the second largest continent on earth, and while the African people at one time in history occupied the whole continent, and while they were one people in their general culture, in their general religion, with certain modification, in their general social laws, in their general legal system, right on down the line, in almost every avenue you could find that there was this kinship, The only thing that they fundamentally different, or where they fundamentally differed, was where, of course, when they divided up and formed separate states, or withdrew, or to form separate societies, and developed different languages from the segmentation or separation from what had been a larger language group, so that there's no problem at all in understanding that you had one people occupying the continent without being under one single state.
Dr. Williams, based on your research of history, is it accurate that democracy was born in Greece?
No, democracy was not born in any one place. The record, as I indicate in this discussion on the chapter dealing with the African Constitution, birth of democracy, meaning birth of democracy in Africa, I made it quite clear that democracy was a system that was natural among the ancient peoples in all stages of development. Even the most primitive societies had their chiefs generally elected, and the chiefs were generally subject to the will of the group. So it was nothing unusual about the head of the society being subject to the will of the tribe, which was one of the early forms of social organization. The family, the clan, the tribe, the nation is the progressive step. So that in Africa, you'll find that back from times immemorial, they had their own system of democracy. And it was this same system which could be found in every part of the African continent. The same fundamental laws, the same fundamental customs. No matter whether they were 5,000 miles apart, no matter whether the group had never come across the other group, they had the same system. That's why we know that we were dealing with substantially one people. So that democracy then was so long, so many thousands of years before Greece, that the mention of Greece in connection with where democracy began could only bring smiles to the face of any scholar who has really studied world history.
What were some of the specific African cultures, civilizations?
These civilizations, I refer to them, of course, generally as the great kingdoms and the great, or the empires that existed all over the continent of Africa. To the south, perhaps the greatest, at least one of the greatest, was the empire of Monomotapa, of which the present Zimbabwe is a part of what was once a much larger empire. And then, of course, those empires of Mali and of Ghana, ancient Ghana, and of Shanghai, and of the Marsi states, and so on. Yet many of these countries had started in a period long before Christ was born. Ghana, for example, had for over 400 kings listed before Christ was born. so that these were ancient empires. The most important thing here, though, to note about these empires and our last name is that all the people in America, all the blacks or Africans in America, came from this area of great nations, of a great educational system, where the greatest university of the time in which these slaves were being brought to America still was flourishing in its glory. That is, of course, the University of Sankore. The great civilizations in Nigeria, all of these were advanced cultures. So these people didn't come, as they were told and came to believe after they had lost memory of their homeland by the system of not allowing people of the same language group to be sold to the same plantation, but scattering them all over the South so that you wouldn't form a power base by having a lot of Africans speaking the same language. So this helped by this breakdown of intercommunication among themselves, helped them to lose memory. But we were told, quite to the contrary, that we were from a land of savages, of cannibals. And except by the grace of God and the white man, we would have been a lost people. So we should be on our knees forever praying and thanking God that we were brought, even in slavery, to this land to escape the horrors of Africa. And this was brought in and drilled into us generation after generation. Until even today, after we're going through from the kindergarten through graduate school, the majority of blacks today reject the idea of being called an Afro-American.
Dr. Williams, if all of the things you say are true, if Africans had such advanced civilizations, hundreds of kings and one African kings in one kingdom before Jesus Christ was born, how did Africans worldwide and Afro-Americans get in the shape they're in? How did these great kingdoms, this great civilization, fall to civilizations that didn't come along until thousands of years after theirs were already established?
Well, it wasn't done overnight. Their great empires were built through their industry, through their enterprising, through their industry in so many fields. And the whole societies, as I point out in the book, in practically all of them, were organized in lodges. This is where the organization of workers, but they regard themselves as craftsmen. And each working group, whether it's building boats, or whether they were stone masons or brick masons, or whether they were carpenters or whatnot, each craft was organized into a lodge. In fact, the educational system was similarly organized on a basis of 3 levels. And so you had a society that went in for production. The people who were specialized in growing rice or cotton or peppers or what have you did so not as Africans do today. Africans you hardly get Africans generally today to go beyond the subsistence level. Just enough for themselves, as though they're scared to produce a surplus for export and to sell to areas which do not produce the same things which they produce, and buy from the other people the things which the other people produce and which they don't have, which is trade, which is progress, which is the basis of wealth worldwide. See what they're talking about, Reaganism and that sort of stuff. There isn't anything new. The Africans were doing that tens of thousands of years ago, a system of life. So they had regular trading posts established in different villages in other countries. They had trading routes that crossed the Sahara into other lands, with merchandise, camels loaded with merchandise of spices, whatever the people produce. They were an industrious people. And they sold, and they would import as well as export. And this is what made them great. I try to emphasize that when you talk about the great African empires, they didn't just become great overnight, just great. No, they became great by doing specific things. They were great people. They were industrious people. They were builders. They were producers. The whole nation was fired to produce, and they were rewarded for their work. And so they built cities and so forth and so forth. And so this is why you had this great system of nation building becoming so mighty. Now, why did they fall? They fell when this began to decline internally, and when the forces, the external forces, over centuries of effort, finally gained the day. These nations had strict laws barring foreigners from coming to the interior. Then the same system of gradually settling around the borders, that is foreign traders, and supposed to be traders, but most of them were geographers and others representing the foreign, would establish little trading posts, just ask for permission to establish trading posts on the border. We don't want to come in, we don't come in, we just want to do business with you. We want to sell you what we have, we want to buy some of what you have. Well, the Africans were great traders, always great traders. So that was one of the weaknesses. They allowed them to settle along the borders, for one thing. The second thing that happened, and this went on, as I point out in the destruction, for several thousand years before the certain countries were finally taken. And when they were taken, like Egypt, look how many times Egypt was taken and retaken.
You say blacks gave up Egypt. Are you saying the Egyptians were black?
Of course the Egyptians were black. The name comes from the name itself, has an origin in the name of a black king. So that it became, the Egyptians were black until it became otherwise. They're not black today, and they're just like those who occupy the northern part of the Sudan are not black today. They are partly Arab, mostly Arab, and some of them are mixed, the Afro-Arabs, you might call them.
You spend quite a bit of time in your book describing the ancient civilization of Ethiopia. What is it you find important about that civilization?
Well, the ancient civilization of Ethiopia was the civilization of what we're now talking about when we talk about that whole stretch of land from the Mediterranean to the source of the Nile, which was ancient Ethiopia. So Egypt was nothing but what we call Egypt now, which was Chem, before the name was changed, was nothing but a northern province of the Ethiopian Empire.
You have a chapter here, Ethiopia's oldest daughter, Egypt. And I'd like to read you a statement you made and get you to comment on it. You say, the melting pot of the races began around the northern perimeter. The end result was always the same. The blacks were pushed to the bottom of the social, economical, and political ladder, whenever and wherever the Asians and their mulatto offsprings gained control. Why is that? Why if with this advanced African civilization, when they interfaced with members of other groups, why did the members of that civilization always end up on the bottom of the ladder?
We have always been, as I repeatedly point out, the race of brotherhood seekers. We have been the one who forever have carried on the drive for brotherhood with other people. They have never sought brotherhood with us, never, except for expediency, where they saw an opportunity to play the role of big brother for a while they gain effective control. Now, they're cunning, you see. They study us, and they know this. They have certain basic advantages. They can easily win our confidence, first of all, because Africa, the whole continent of Africa, was known as the land of the religious people. We didn't start all this religion in America, you know, being more religious than the whites. No, this is an African characteristic. We were known from ancient times as the land of the spiritual people, the land of the gods, because we were so religious. The blameless people, Homeless wrote. We were so religious. So this must be kept in mind in this general appraisal.
How significant was the oral historian in the reconstruction of African history?
Well, the oral historian was indispensable. If you're going to make a comparative study of history, in which you're going to compare what had been written, and since it all was written by foreigners, with what the Africans themselves had written, and the records of their mind, and the records of their mind turned out to be as accurate and as unerring in many respects as what is written in books.
For a transcript, send $2 to Tony Brown Productions, 1501 Broadway, Suite 2014, New York, New York, 10036.
Some more information about us. And one of the ways that we feel that is instrumental in disseminating information in the community is by bringing some of our learned scholars into the area. So without any further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce Brother Ndugu Kujichapalia, who is the business agent and personal associate of Professor Jackson. And he will give a personal introduction about the life and times of learned scholar. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Brother Kujichapalia.
Young as our name, brothers and sisters. I'm so overwhelmed to be here. I think I better get on with the business, so if I'm that overwhelmed, I might fall to the ground, and I don't want to do that. I do wish to pay recognition and acknowledgement to the African Research Committee. If it were not for them, we would not be here. So Professor Jackson and I traveled a whole heaps of miles coming from the Midwest, a place called the Windy City that's supposed to be in Chicago, in the great prairie state of Illinois. And we are more than grateful to be here to try and render service to you if we can. So I'm going to try and fulfill the assignment as given. I'm a very obedient person when it comes to that. It says a biographical sketch, a background on Professor John G. Jackson. And professor is one who teaches different from a professor. And we are all professors because we profess something. John G. Jackson was born April 1, 1907 in Aiken, South Carolina. During his student days, he did researching and writing articles about Afro-American life. He wrote for Negro World in 1925 and was a regular contributor to The Truth Seeker between 1930 and 1955. In 1932, he became an associate director of the Blyden Society, then under the leadership of Dr. Willis N. Huggins. The most talented student to come out of the group was John Henry Clark. And if I might pause just a wee bit, when we say John Henry Clark, we sometimes should stop with silence to give recognition and acknowledgement, because Brother Clark is one who deserves such. In 1934, Brother Jackson co-authored with Dr. Huggins a guide to study of African history, and in 1937, also with Dr. Huggins, Introduction to African Civilizations, which they are in abundance over at the table there in the rear. Professor Jackson has taught and lectured in the Black Studies Department of Newark College of Arts and Sciences, 1971 through 1973. A visiting professor at the City University of New York, 1973 to 1977, and a visiting professor at Northeastern Illinois University from 1977 through 1980. That's located in Chicago, and I heard the brother before me speak about the community, and in that building we housed something of such activity back some time ago, headed by the late brother Bobby Wright, which many of you know about or heard of. Okay. In addition, he was a regular lecturer in the Ingersoll Forum from 1930 through 1955, and at the Harlem Unitarian Church. His two recent works, Introduction to African Civilization, 1970, and Man, God, and Civilization. Recently, he published, or authored, that is, Christianity Before Christ, 1986. And the most recent thing, Black Reconstruction in South Carolina, Hubert Henry Harrison, the Black Socrates, and the Golden Ages of Africa. And the last publication is chapter 2 of a book in which the brother is now going to commence writing on in high gear with great deliberation for the next 6 or 7 months after leaving your fair city of Oakland. And the title of the book will be On a History of the World, which, as you might know, if I may indulge upon your intelligence, the book History of the World, as has been written all before, has never included Africa. And if you recall, John Henry Clark, Brother Jackson, and others, Queen Mother Moore, and several persons of the African community tried to argue with UNESCO of the United Nations to try and put Africa into history books. But somehow the brother's intelligence rose to the surface and to the occasion to say, why argue with someone if we know what we're doing and they know not what they're doing? We will commence to do just that. So the brother has commenced to do that, and I hope we will all give recognition and acknowledgement to such if this is be the case. So it's many, many experiences Brother Jackson and I have undergone, and we have enjoyed together. He's a very hard brother, but since he's from Arkansas, South Carolina, the Prostrate State, and I'm from Red Stick, Louisiana, the Bayou country, I seem to sort of excel a little taste, maybe if by age alone. But before I sit, Brother Ben Yosef Yakanan and John Henry Clark gave me an assignment, say, James, take care of John. So James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the disciples, I'm one of them, and he's the other one. And I just found out something about him. He's been a knighted bishop. I didn't know anything about him. So at any rate, without further ado and enjoying all of the accolades that you have laid before me, I'm going to bring up the elder, and I will let him go from there. Brother John G. Jackson.
Step over this, will you? Step up. There you go.
Now, since this is a church, I will address you as brothers and sisters. Now, I've got a lot of notes here, but I want to make just a short talk and let you people ask me some questions. I probably won't have answers to most of them, but if I know the answer, I'll give it to you. If I don't, I'll tell you that I don't know. But Cage brought up some of my misconduct in the past. In New York about 50 years ago, I was writing articles for a magazine called The Truth Seeker, and I was lecturing for an organization known as the Ingersoll Forum, named after a great American statesman, Colonel Robert G. Ingersoll. And the editor of The Truth Seeker was also the chairman of the Ingersoll Forum, a man named Charles Smith from Arkansas. So Smith says, Jackson, would you like to be a bishop? I says, don't joke. He says, well, there's a new church out, and I think it's out in Denver, Colorado. The Supreme Pontiff of the Liberal Church of America will appoint anybody a bishop that'll send him in a donation of $1. So I thought the whole thing was a joke. So I handed Charlie Smith $1. I says, okay, send in my application. And lo and behold, I got a document stating that I had been appointed a bishop of the Liberal Church of America and that I could get liquid spirits at half price, travel at reduced fares on railroad trains, and perform marriage ceremonies. Well, I considered the whole thing a joke, and I said to Charlie Smith, where will I be bishop? He says, well, you live in Harlem, you'll be the bishop of Harlem. So, of course, I treated it as a joke, but I lectured at places like the YMCA and the Unitarian Church, and the joke caught on, and the people were introducing me as Bishop Jackson. Now, back in 1938, I wrote a little pamphlet called Christianity Before Christ. And last year, I had rewritten this stuff and got it into a book, and now it's a book on Christianity Before Christ. The right title for that book should have been The African Origin of Christianity. But I realized that if I gave it that title, very few people would buy the book, because a sad feature about black people today is that most of them are almost totally illiterate. They can't read anything anymore. Television have robbed them of what little literacy they had. So if I just called it Christianity Before Christ, in hopes that a few white intellectuals would read it. And it worked out all right. The book came out late in 1985. It's been out just a little over a year now. and I think the publisher sold over 1,000 copies, so that's not bad for a serious book. When I was teaching at the City University of New York, I was using 2 of my books as textbooks, Introduction to African Civilizations and Man, God, and Civilization. So one of my students came and said, "Professor Jackson, is there any money in writing?" I said, "Why do you ask that question?" He said, "Well, I figured if there was any money in writing, I would become a writer." I said, "Well, wait a minute, young man." I said, you were talking through it. I said, "If you had a hat on, I'd say you were talking through it." I said, "If you have musical ability, you become a musician. If you have scholarly ability, you become a professor. If you have medical ability, you become a doctor. If you have legal ability, you become a lawyer." I says, "Now, if you can write, you can become a writer." I said, but knowing you only slightly, I have an idea that you couldn't write anything that anybody would want to read." So one of the students got up and said, "Why do you take that attitude?" I said, "Well, I've been teaching at this institution for quite a while now, and I asked all my students to turn in a term paper, and I says, it's only 10 pages long, and they can't write 10 pages. They go clip pictures out of newspapers and put a picture on every other page, so that I get about 5 pages of text. I says, now you fellas can't write 10 pages on a term paper, how are you going to write books? I will never win a popularity contest because I'm honest with my students, and they don't appreciate that. I had a class at City University of New York where, although it was in the college, I found out that most of my students were reading on the 4th grade reading level, a 4th grade reading level in college, and I frankly told them that most of them seemed to have the brain capacity of a mentally retarded mule. So one young lady got up and told me that she demanded an apology. And I said, young lady, I will not apologize for telling the truth. Now, one of the reasons why you will listen to me tonight is because I'm not a member of the club. I think you might know what the club is. That's the Academic Racket Club. The way you work it is that you start out and you go through low school. They call that elementary school. That's low school. Then that takes up 8 years. Then you go 4 years of high school, and then 4 years as an undergraduate student in college. And if you're studying for a profession, you do 4 more years of graduate work in a university. Now, that's not what happened to me. I was not good in school. I was a student in a little school down in Aiken, South Carolina called the Schofield School, established in 1868 by Martha Schofield, old maid school mom from Quaker from Pennsylvania. And I went to the Schofield School, and it was a good school. I mean, it was the best school in the state, in Aiken, South Carolina, that colored people could go to. I don't know how good the white school was, but they gave them more money, so it might have been a little better. But I went to the Schofield School for several years, and I was a student there from during the First World War. I remember that I was a student in the Schofield School back during the years of 1915, 1916, 1917. This was the European War, and President Thomas Woodrow Wilson decided that the United States should go over to Europe and save democracy. Wilson said he was going to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson was born in Virginia, and he couldn't even make Virginia safe for democracy, but he was going to make the world safe for democracy. So he got into the war. But at any rate, I would be sitting in class, and since I was a fast reader, whatever the assignment was, I always read it way in advance, and I knew what was going to be covered. And therefore, while the teacher was telling the other students what the message was, I already had it. And I sat in the back of the class and read the newspapers about how the Germans and French were slaughtering up each other wholesale on the Western Front in France. And some of the students went home and told their parents that they had to sit there and listen to the teacher, and this little Jackson boy was sitting in the back of the room reading newspapers. So the teacher went to the principal and told him what the complaint was. So the principal says, Miss So-and-so, does this Jackson boy answer the right, when you ask him a question, does he give you the right answer? She says, yes, he jumps up and gives me the right answer, and then he sits down and started reading the newspaper again. He said, leave him alone. As long as he's getting the lesson, don't bother him. Well, I found out that I got a bad press down there. I got up to the 7th grade, and my scholastic records were so good until the principal of the school came and said, Johnny, you're such a good scholar until we are going to skip you over the 7th grade and put you into the 8th grade. And I thanked him. A few days later, he comes in and he says, the parents of the children who are not being promoted over the 7th grade and the 8th grade have staged a protest. And they say that if we shove you over the 7th grade into the 8th, they're going to pull all their students out of the school. So we'll have to insist on you going through the 7th grade. So I went through the 7th grade and then went into the school and handed in my resignation. I said I should have been finishing the 8th grade, but you wouldn't let me do it, so I quit. So but then I went to my father. He says, well, now that I have dropped out at the end of the 7th grade, where do I go now? My father says, we're going over to Augusta, Georgia. There's a lady over there who's a great educator, Miss Lucy Laney, the Haynes Institute. Says you got through the 7th grade, and I'm going to go over there and tell Miss Laney to put you in her high school. So I went to Augusta and put in 1 year at the Haynes Institute High School. And then I finished up the 1st year. And my mother told me, she says, boy, I don't think you're going to get a good education down here. I'm going to take you up to New York so that you can go to a good high school in New York and get yourself a good education. So my mother and myself came up to New York in 1922, and I got a job down in the Wall Street district. It didn't bring me any more money. I mean, everybody else in Wall Street was getting rich except me. But it was down in that section. So I would go to Stuyvesant High School in the morning. That's one of the best high schools in the whole country. I got an education at Stuyvesant High School between 1922 and 26 that's better than you can get in the average college today, because they had high standards back in those days. Now you can go through low school, high school, college, and university, get a PhD after your name and still be an idiot. In those days you couldn't do it. Now I've been asked to, I haven't finished the story yet. I graduated from high school. Then I got a job working as a red cap. Some of you people probably don't know what a red cap is because we don't have many railroads around today. But red caps are people who dressed up in a uniform with a red cap, and they would carry bags to and from trains in railroad stations and try to live off the tips that the people give them. There's no salary to the job. You put on a uniform and work 10 hours a day and hope that you would make enough money to pay your rent and grocery bill. So I put in 10 hours a day red capping, and then attended night classes at the City College of New York. And I was so sleepy when I went to classes until I slept through all the lectures. And they managed to stand my society for 4 years. And then they told me that since I missed all the lectures and was giving all the wrong answers on the examination paper, that if I didn't improve, they were going to boot me out of the school. Well, I couldn't improve, so I dropped out. So then I decided that since I couldn't stay in college, that I had to have an education, and I knew the right people. I knew a man named Mr. Arthur A. Schomburg, who was the curator of the Schomburg Library in New York. You all heard about that. And I would be sitting in there at the big round table and educating myself through the 10,000 books in the Schomburg collection. And whenever I got stuck, Mr. Schomburg would come over and give me a helping hand. And sometimes as we sat there, J.A. Rogers would come in. You all know about J.A. Rogers. Rogers would come in and sit next to me, so I had teachers like Arthur A. Schomburg, J.A. Rogers, and Dr. Hubert Henry Harrison, who is a black scholar that you probably never heard of. And the only reason you never heard of him was because he was black. If you were a white man, they'd have monuments built to him all over the country. Now, here's what I'm leading up to. When I was a boy down in Aiken, South Carolina, at Sunday school, I was taught that God created the white man as the superior race. And he, after the flood, when Noah was celebrating the end of this great deluge, he got drunk and took off all of his clothes and was doing the striptease. And one of his sons, named Ham, thought that this was really funny, and he started laughing. And God looked down from heaven and said, I will not tolerate this disrespect for parents. So he turned Ham black and shipped him off to Africa, and he doomed Ham and all of his descendants to be hewers of wood and drawers of water for their more fortunate brothers. In other words, Africa was of no importance in world history because it was settled by an accursed race. And I got this story in church. When I went to school, I got the same story. And then I would go to church and the preacher would get up and ask us to sing a hymn, "Oh Lord, bleach us out whiter than snow that we may enter into the kingdom of heaven." And then I say to myself, I don't think I'm going to make it. Then they had him another one. You can have all the world, but just give me Jesus. And I began to have the idea that there was something wrong with this. I couldn't imagine that everybody else had a history, but only the African people didn't have one. And then I began to study the theory of evolution. And the Bible, the way the Bible has been corrupted by white folks, you get the idea that the human race started out being white, and that the superior type of human being is a white man, and the yellow people and the brown people and the red people, they are a little bit lower, but the black man is the low man on the totem pole. He's the nobody. So I said to myself, I know there's something wrong with this. So I got up to Harlem and heard Dr. Harrison lecture and heard J.A. Rogers give lectures, and I went and studied with Schomburg, and they began to tell me what to read and what to study. And then I found out that the first human beings were not white folks, they were black people, because the human race started in Africa millions of years ago. And these black people were the first members of the human race, and some of them wandered into Europe and got bleached out white, and some of them wandered into Asia and got bleached out yellow, and some of them wandered into America and got bleached out red. But the original man was the black man. And then I found out another thing, that in these these people wrote their own histories, and the Christians say that God is an oversized man. Their image of God is a big man. These ancient people in Africa said that the first God was a woman. They said because in the process of evolution, the female sex is the primary sex, and it comes first. So the woman must have become before the man. And if the first human being was made in the image of God, God must have been a woman. And there's a book out now by an author named Merlin Stone, When God Was a Woman. Now, I began to study, and I found out that you go back and study the ancient history of Egypt, and especially the religion of ancient Egypt, and they had a Bible. I have a good English translation of it in 3 volumes in one, called the Theban Recension of the Book of the Dead. And in this, you take this Egyptian Bible and compare it with the King James Bible, which is popular among the Protestant denominations in the United States. And you study the Egyptian Bible and you study the Christian Bible. The Egyptian Bible goes back 10,000 years. The King James Bible only goes back about 300 years. The King James, I think it was about 1619. And then you study these 2 books and compare them, and you find out that the Christians took the whole Christian Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, out of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So that if you want to go to the source, don't go to King James. Go to ancient Egypt, and you've got a Bible that's 10,000 years older than anything that these Christians have. Now, after studying this, I decided to do some research and writing, and after dropping out of college, I would work on a job in the day and go to the library and study at night. In those days, they kept the libraries open until 11 o'clock at night, so that if you couldn't go to school, you could go to the library. Nowadays, they close, sometimes the library closes early, so if you wait, you're not going there. I had the good fortune to be born before there was any radio and before there was any television, so I had to learn to read, write, and count. Today, with television and radio, you have students going through college, graduating with a degree, and then they can't even write their own name. There was a University of Iowa, a student who was a football player. He graduated with a BA after his name. He was planning to be a professional football player. He had an accident and broke one of his feet, so he had to take a job as a parking lot attendant. And then when he signed the job application, he misspelled his own name. This is what you have going on today. Now, here's what I wanted to say. According to the King James Version of the Bible, if you go to a Protestant church, you find a big Bible there, and in the back of it, they have the chronology of Archbishop Usher of the 16th century. An Irish archbishop of the 16th century, and he tells you how old the world is according to the King James Version of the Bible. And he tells you that God created the earth in the year 4004 BC. And I began to study the history of Africa, particularly the history of Ethiopia and Egypt. And I found out that the Egyptians built the Great Pyramid over 1,000 years before the earth was created. And then I ran across another biblical scholar, the Vice Chancellor, the Reverend Professor Lightfoot, Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University, and he improved on Usher. He says, God created the world in the year 4004 BC on September the 22nd. It was either September or October, I don't remember it, at 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, I'm wondering what day of the week was it? And if the world was created on this particular day, on this particular year, at 9 o'clock in the morning, what happened at 8 o'clock? I mean, you have all these unanswerable questions. So then I began to do research, and we were told that this godlike white man, the first civilization in the world was that of the Greeks. They was supposed to be the most intellectual white people that ever lived. And that they created a great civilization and then passed it on to the Romans. And all the great civilizations were created by white folks. Back in 1934, an English historian named Arnold J. Toynbee wrote a study in history, a history of the world in 12 volumes. Don't try, if you find the book in the library, don't try to read it, because one of the hardest books to read is Karl Marx's Capital, and he was an even worse writer than Marx was. That's a record. Toynbee says there have been 21 civilizations in the world. So many were created by the white race, so many by the yellow race, so many by the brown race, so many by the red race. The black race has not created one civilization, none at all. We have done nothing. So I was giving a lecture in New York, and somebody says, well, didn't Toynbee know that Egyptians were black people? I says, Toynbee says they were white people. You see, if you are a racist historian, you don't have any regard for the facts at all. I visited West Africa in 1977, Senegal. Then I went to Kenya, that used to be British East Africa. Then on up to Egypt, to Cairo, and to outside of Cairo to look at the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, and then took a plane up the Nile River to the ruins of Thebes and walked through the temple of Ammon at Amun-Ra that was built in 3700 BC, the greatest temple that was ever built in the world. And I saw all of these great things. And we know that black people built all these things. And yet Toynbee was supposed to be the greatest historian of his day, a professor at Oxford University, and he tells you that these people were white. And if you listen to these people, you'll get your mind terribly balled up. Down in Kenya, outside of Nairobi, I visited a village of people that called the Maasais. The Maasais of the same racial stock as the ancient Egyptians and the Ethiopians. And while I'm standing there looking the village over, some of these people came up and I was shocked. All the authorities that I had consulted told me that these people were members of the white race. And they were blue-black. In Senegal, where they say the people are Negroes, most of them were sort of medium brown color. None of them were actually black, but they are Negroes. And then you go over to East Africa among the Maasais, and most of them are blacker than a blackboard, and they're white people. So, I mean, if you're going to get the lowdown on history, you've got to use your own head, not somebody else's. Now, I found out that the Greeks, who were supposed to have been the founders of civilization because they were the first civilized white folks, but the Greeks got their civilization from the Egyptians. And the Egyptians were black people. And the Greeks passed their civilization on to the Romans. And the Romans were a very stupid, dumb bunch of people for the most part. They couldn't retain it. They lost it. They had a dark age in Europe for 500 years. And then another bunch of Africans, the Moors, from North Africa, moved into Spain and started civilization all over again. So instead of Europe civilizing Africa, Africa has civilized Europe 2 times. So that's what you have to keep in mind. And now I want to say something about why it is that I have to be talking to you about African history. The reason I'm talking to you about it is because it's not in the textbooks. And it's not in the textbooks because we don't write textbooks. We have other people write the textbooks and they put that propaganda in there, and we are supposed to swallow it. Now, we are told that after the Greeks were taken over by the Romans and that civilization decayed, and then the Roman civilization went down after the fall of Rome, and you had a 500-year dark age. We were told that Christianity re-civilized Europe and produced modern civilization. And we know, if we read the literature, that these white Christians of Europe are the dumbest people that ever lived. They said that the earth was flat like a pancake out in the vastness of space, with the sun and the moon and all the stars going around it. The ancient Egyptians in the Pyramid Age 6,000 years ago knew that the world was round. They knew that it went around the sun in 365 1/4 days, and their astronomers measured the earth, and they knew what the polar diameter was. They knew what the equatorial diameter was. They measured the circumference of the earth, and they calculated it so accurately until modern astronomers said their error was only 1 yard. In other words, the circumference of the earth is about 25,000 miles, and they calculated it with an error of about this, 1 yard. So if you read history the way it happened and not the way other people wrote about it, you will find out that the black race created the civilization, civilized the white folks 2 times. So that you want to get some perspective on this. And the white folks took the religion of ancient Egypt, of Ethiopian Egypt, and balled it up completely. They'll tell you that if you get some of this cheap literature like the Jehovah's Witnesses people turn out. I remember seeing one of their quarterlies. God is sitting up on a golden throne in heaven, blue eyes, blonde hair. Next to him is Jesus Christ, also with blue eyes and blonde hair. On the other side is the Holy Ghost, also white, and a bunch of angels in the background white. And a bunch of people kneeling on the ground worshiping this God, black and white. Underneath is hell with the devil black and all the imps black. So it looks as though since white people are not admitted into the Christian heaven, then we all going to wind up in hell. But I told my students they had nothing to worry about, because the only unpleasant thing about hell was the heat. It's too hot down there. But since if you go there, you're going to stay a long time, and if you stay long enough, you get used to the heat, so that then it won't bother you anymore. And then I found out that the Africans were dragged into the slave trade because the white folks were too lazy to work and produce the things that they wanted. And they dragged us into slavery, converted us to their particular brand of Christianity. And the African had a much better religion over in Africa. That's what I call Christianity before Christ. He had a much better religion. The Christians tell you that there's a God sitting up on a throne in some place called heaven who created the whole universe, and he created the human race, and they turned out to be such a voiceless bunch of people, and they had to have a flood drown out most of them to give the race a new start. And then this new bunch of people went to pot and finally had to send his only son down to be crucified to save these people. And that's what they call the Christian scheme of salvation. Now the Africans had a religion which was much better. In ancient Egypt, if you will see a copy of my new book called Christianity Before Christ, and there's a long section in there on the mysteries of Egypt. Those are the religious rites of the ancient Egyptians. And you will find out that these people, in other words, there are two types of religion in the world. Supernatural religions or theistic religions, and then you have natural religions or atheistic religions. A lot of people have an idea that if a man is an atheist, that is, if he doesn't believe in a personal God, he's an irreligious person. That's not true. The Africans had an atheistic type of religion, and they were a deeply religious people because they believed in that man not only has a body, but he also has a mind, soul, or spirit. And they took the position, for instance, if you went to a temple in ancient Egypt and told the priest that you wanted Horus, the Egyptian Christ, to save your soul, he would tell you not to waste his time. That Horus, Osiris, Isis, or nobody else is going to save your soul except you. In other words, they tell you this. They say, we believe in reincarnation. You have lived before. You've come back to the world. And if you want a better life, the next time you come back, you'll have to earn it yourself. The gods are not going to give it to you. And the Egyptians told these people, if you want a better life the next time you come back to the earth, you live a good life now, and then when you come back, you'll have a better life. But if you lead an evil life, the next time you come back, it'll be worse. So it's up to you. Yeah, so that they told people not to pray to gods or angels or anything to save them. It was their job to save themselves. And I think that's a better religion than asking some dead Jew to save you. Now, these people, they believed in spiritualism and they believed in theosophy. And the whole world, all the religions of the world can be traced back to this African source. And Christians say their religion is true, but paganism is false. And as I've told some preachers, Christianity was stolen from the pagans. So if paganism is false, so is Christianity. Now, you say to yourself, well, when the African, a member of anyone who believes in the African traditional religion, he tells you that he believes in God. But he doesn't believe in the type of God that the white folks believe in. The white folks believe that God is an oversized white man sitting on a throne somewhere up in a place called heaven. The African traditional religion teaches you that there's a large number of gods. You have tree gods, sun gods, moon gods, earth gods, star gods, and all like that. And since a group of colleges make up a university, then a group of the little gods make up the big God. So you take all the little gods and merge them together, and you get the great God, which is the universe itself. It never started, it never was created, and it'll never have an end. And so therefore they said that the great God is nature itself, the universe, and they believed in a doctrine of the Trinity. God is the physical universe. Christ is the mental universe. And matter and mind interact and produce life. So you get a trinity of matter, life, and mind. And that's it. And to show you how we have been badly miseducated and misled, one of my friends is a great black scholar, Professor Yosef Ben Yochanan of Cornell University. Some of you probably met Dr. Ben. Ben went into the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where they have a very fine Egyptian collection. And the young lady is sitting at the desk. Sir, what can I do for you? Dr. Ben says, I would like to visit the African collection. The young lady says, sir, we do not have an African collection. And Dr. Ben says, I meant to say the Egyptian collection. Oh, yes, we have an Egyptian collection. But you know the ancient Egyptians were not white people. Now, the ancient Egyptians, you know, yes, we have an Egyptian collection, but the ancient Egyptians were not Africans. So Ben pulls a map out of his pocket, shoves it right in this girl's face. Young lady, here's a map of Africa, and there's Egypt. Wouldn't you say that Egypt was in Africa? She said, I could say so. Ben says, do you say so? She said, no. Ben says, young lady, you are a jackass. The young lady became hysterical. She hollered for the manager. The manager came out and running and says, what's the trouble? Mr. Manager, this man just called me a jackass. So the manager says, what's the problem? Ben told her the story that he was looking for the Egyptian collection, and this young lady said that the Egyptians were not Africans. And he says, I have a map here, and here's Egypt, and Egypt is a part of Africa. Wouldn't you say so? The man says, well, you could say so. Do you? No. Ben says, you also a jackass. So he said then he ducked out and got out of the vicinity because he was afraid they're going to call the police and put him in the jug for disorderly conduct. So this is the way we have been miseducated. Now, since Egypt was a great African culture, we find out that a few years ago, there were no black Egyptologists. We did have one recently, but he died at an untimely age, and that was Dr. Diop of Senegal. I visited him over in Africa and talked with him back in 1977, and Diop, besides being an Egyptologist, he was a lot of other things besides. So then we have a young lady who is an authority on Egyptology. She's now working for the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago and doing research in New York as Mrs. Deidre Wimby. You might have heard of her. She's a young lady that is going to be the first black woman Egyptologist. Now, there was a brilliant scholar at Howard University a few years ago, Professor William Leo Hansberry. He graduated from Howard. He went to Harvard University and was planning to work for a PhD in Egyptology under Professor George Reisner. He was one of the outstanding Egyptologists in this country. And Reisner got up before the class and says, of course you know that the ancient Egyptians were white people. And after he got through, Hansberry put up his hand. Well, Mr. Hansberry, what's your question? He says, I want to challenge that statement you made about the ancient Egyptians being white people. He says, I read Herodotus' history of Egypt, and he says the ancient Egyptians had black complexions and curly hair. He says, well, Mr. Hansberry, I don't accept Herodotus as an authority. So Hansberry tackled him. He says, listen, Professor, Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, and he saw these people. You didn't visit them, and you didn't see them. So Hansberry had him kicked out of his class. So here he was trying to get a PhD in Egyptology, and the professor of Egyptology booted him out of the class. So he went to see the head of the Department of Anthropology, Professor Ernest Albert Houghton. And he says, Professor Houghton, what shall I do now? He says, well, Mr. Hansberry, he said, if Reisner won't give you a PhD, you're not going to get it in this country. He said, I think you should go over to England and try to sign up at either Oxford or Cambridge. And he gave him some references. And he went over there and he told him that he wanted to get a PhD in Egyptology. And the people in England were more honest. At both Cambridge and Oxford, they told him that they did not want any black Egyptologists, so they weren't going to give him a degree. So Hansberry had to come back to the United States and get a job as a professor of history at Howard University. And then when he retired, he went to Nigeria and was given a position as the director of the Hansberry Institute of African Studies, or some such title as that. And he was running a school of African history in Africa, and he was writing a 4-volume history of Africa. After finishing 2 volumes, he died. And the publishers couldn't find anybody else to finish the other 2 volumes, so they buried it. This is probably the greatest history of Africa that's ever been written, and the publishers have decided not to publish it. So we are being crossed up at every turn. And you find out that to show you what a vicious breed of people these racists are, in my book, Man, God, and Civilization, I quote a psychologist from the University of Chicago. This was back around 1909, a man named Professor R.M. Cattell. And in this book, he said that the whole Negro race should be painlessly exterminated because they were a menace to humanity. Fortunately, people didn't buy his argument. They didn't round up all the black people and have them exterminated for the benefit of humanity. But the way the world is going now, if we can't retake our fame, as Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden said, if we were once on top, if we can't get on top again, they probably will exterminate us. And people tell me, well, how are we going to do it? Well, I'm a retired member of a union in New York City, District 65, UAW, AFL-CIO, and we say that if you have a problem, you have to solve it. Nobody else is going to do it for you. And our union, if we had a problem, we solved it. We went out on a strike and we were walking the picket line for weeks, and it looked as though we were going to lose. But we kept plugging along. We finally won the strike, and there was a victory celebration. Our union had 50,000 members. And one of the members got up and said to the president, why did we win this strike? We had everything against us, and yet we won. How did it come about? And the president says, we won because we couldn't afford to lose. So that's our position now. If we want to survive, we can't afford to lose. And it's going to be up to us to see to it that we do survive. About 50 years ago, they had a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago, Professor Thomas V. Smith. And he had a class in Philosophy 1. And when he got a bunch of students together and gave the first lecture, he says, "My dear students, before giving my first lecture, I want to tell you a little story because I think it'll help you out." He says, "An old maid went to bed one night, went to sleep, and she dreamt that in the middle of the night she woke up and there was a handsome young man standing by her bed. And she looked up and she says, 'Young man, what are you going to do to me?' And the young man bowed politely and says, 'Lady, that is up to you. This is your dream.'" And the message I tried to pass on to my students is that no matter how hopeless the situation is, we're going to continue to struggle. You might lose, but if you don't struggle, you're certainly not going to win. So that's the only thing to do. And in the Union, I found out how it was that people won. To show you how this Union worked. There was an Orthodox Jew who owned a big company in New York. And the Union couldn't come to an agreement with him. They put picket lines around his plant. And he hired a bunch of gangsters to intimidate the Union. One of the gangsters grabbed one of our members as he was going to join the picket line and stuck a knife in his back. The knife went right through his back into his heart and killed him almost instantly. The Union president called a meeting of the members, and he said, "We don't know what hand wielded the knife that killed our brother, but we do know the man that hired the man that wielded the knife. He has killed one of our brothers. We are going to kill him." So they got up, and one of the Union members said, "Mr. President, how are we going to do it? It's, you go out and kill a man and you get convicted for murder." He says, "We're going to kill him so that nobody can convict us." Yeah. So they said, "Well, how do we do it?" They says, "Well, Mr. So-and-so, who hired the murderer that killed our brother, he is a member of a certain synagogue here. He says that when the synagogue services come along on the Jewish Sabbath, we're going to picket pickets in front of the place and says, 'Rabbi, you have a murderer in your temple.' Well, the rabbi comes out and finds that his temple is being picketed. And he asked them, 'Who is the murderer?' They told him. The man sitting in his congregation, he says, 'Don't come back into this thing and settle it.' He says, 'I don't want a murderer in my congregation and picket lines around my synagogue.' So he couldn't come to his synagogue anymore. So he went up to upstate New York and hired a cottage by a lake. The Union went up there, rented boats, crossed the lake, and picketed this college. 'You have murdered one of our brothers, and you will pay for it.' So that depressed him so until he moved back to New York City and got himself a fine home. And then the Union set up a committee to telephone him all through the night hours of all the hours of the night, so that this guy, after he moved into his New York home, the telephone rang all night long and he never got any sleep. Well, you know what happens if you put for a long period of time if you don't sleep. Here was a young man, not quite 29 years old, and we harassed him so until he dropped dead of a heart attack. We killed him, and yet the law couldn't touch us. I've heard, I knew a preacher in New York that I admired greatly, Elder S.J. Worrell. They called him Steamboat Bill, because in his younger days he'd been a buck and wing dancer on the showboat in the Mississippi River. When he retired, he became an evangelist. He started a church in Harlem, and he got up on street corners and taught the people the kind of religion they should be getting. They weren't getting it in the regular churches because all the regular churches had turned into rackets. But Steamboat Bill was giving them the true gospel. I attended one of his meetings, and in order to get a crowd, he set up a stepladder, and he would tap dance up and down the stepladder, and then spin around on his heels on top, and then tap dance back, and the people would come to see him dance. And then after he got through, he would preach his sermon. So Steamboat Bill would say, brothers and sisters, he says, the other preachers around here are trying to sell you pie in the sky. He says, that's not my program. I'm trying to get you a better lifestyle in this world. He says, and we'll deal with the next world when we come to it. He says, now, you've been badly misinformed. He says, I know a man that lives in an apartment right across the street, and he's afraid to come outside. He owes everybody. 6 o'clock in the morning, somebody taps on the door, and he's afraid to answer, but a card comes under the door. He owns a second-hand car, and the automobile man wants to know when he's going to get the next installment. A few minutes more, there's a tap on the door. He owes somebody else for a radio set that he's bought on the installment plan. And this keeps on until about 9 o'clock. There's a loud bang on the door. And he's afraid somebody's going to knock the door down. So he says, who is it? And the voice comes back, it's the Lord. And the man says, what Lord? The landlord. Steamboat Bill says, that's the only Lord that most of you jokers are ever going to see. So, just about this time, the meeting got livened up. A drunk came by. Here was a brother that had not one drink too many, he'd had a lot of drinks too many. And he's staggering around. He stops in front of Steamboat Bill's meeting, and he shook his fist at him. Oh, nigga, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. Steamboat Bill says, listen, young man, if you want to stand here and listen to my discourse, you're welcome. But I do not permit you to disrupt my meeting. So the young man shook his fist again. Oh, nigga, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. Steamboat says, listen, young man, according to the Bible, Jesus Christ says that you slap me on one cheek, I'm supposed to let you slap me on the other. Well, I want you to know one thing. I ain't Jesus Christ. If you slap me on one side of my face, I'm coming down and bust hell out of you. So, unfortunately, Steamboat Bill died a year later. If it hadn't been for that, I was going to join his church. Because here was a man that not only had a church, but a depression was on, and he opened up a free lunch kitchen in his church, and the unemployed people could come around there and get free sandwiches, free coffee, free cake and all like that, and he went around and raised the money to finance this program. And he told the people, he says, it doesn't do me any good to save your soul if your body is hungry, so I've got to feed you first. Now, all of that leads up to this, that if we are going to save ourselves, we're not going to have a lily white God and a Jim Crow Jesus save us. We've got to do the job ourselves. And this idea of being submissive and meek and all like that is not going to get us anywhere. We can defend ourselves if we do it intelligently. You don't go out and attack a Sherman tank if all you had was a BB gun or slingshot. There's another way you have to do it. When I was at Grand Central Station at a Red Cap, I met a young man there who had been working on the job a number of years, and he had a special problem. He was sent down to the lower level of Grand Central Station, which is on 42nd Street in New York, and the vice president came in from the suburbs, and this red cap was detailed to carry his bags out to the street. And every time he went down there, the man insulted him. You know, stuff like, boy, pick up my bag, nigga, get a move on, or something like that. And the young man knew if he gave him an argument, being the vice president of the railroad, he'd lose his job. He couldn't afford to lose his job. But he was determined that he was going to punish this man. So one day he went down to get the suitcase of the vice president, and he was the only person on the train. There was the entire lower level of Grand Central Station, and the vice president and the red cap, and nobody else in the vicinity. So this young man hauled off and hit this man in the jaw and broke his jaw. Knocked him completely unconscious and laying on the platform bleeding. Somebody later on come and found him, called an ambulance, they put him on a stretcher and carried him, I have water here. And they put him on the stretcher and took him to the hospital. Then when he got his jaw back together, he came back and swore out a warrant to, that this red cap committed assault and battery on him, broke his jaw, nearly killed him and all the rest of it. So the red cap was hailed up before a judge. The vice president told him how this man beat hell out of him. And then the judge said to the red cap, "Did you commit assault and battery on this man?" He said, "No, I didn't. It must be a case of mistaken identity. I wasn't there." And then he said to the vice president, "Do you have any witnesses that saw this man beat you?" He said, "No." He says, "Case dismissed." This red cap broke his jaw, beat him nearly to death, and the judge threw out the case because there were no witnesses. So you don't have to be meek and submissive. You can get your point if you go about it in the intelligent way. And after that, the vice president was very nice to the red cap. He was afraid he might get his other jaw broken, so he kept his big mouth shut. I see I have a note here that we're going to have some discussion or questions or something like that, so I'll now stop. And the floor is open for, I think we'd better make it questions because discussions will take up too much time. So you ask me some questions and I'll see can't I give you the right answers. Okay.
Okay, first of all, let's give Professor Jackson a hand for being here.
No, I stand. It's all right.
Okay, those of you who have questions, I'd like you to come up if you're in the front, to come to the forward mic, or if you're in the back. Okay. Brother in the back first.
I have one question for you, Dr. Jackson, regarding race. You indicated that earlier that the Greeks, I guess, was the beginning of white civilization. I've been told that blacks have like curly hair and dark complected skin. And I've seen some Greeks. I also go back to the Hebrews, the Jews, the original. I was told that the original Jews were also blacks and Hebrews coming from Ethiopia. If I'm correct, I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that.
Oh yes, the original Jews were black people. These white Jews that you see were European Jews that lived in the southern part of Russia, and they were converted by Jewish missionaries. So the original Jews were black, and the ones that have set up the state of Israel, they're not Jews at all. And how they got away with this skullduggery, I don't know. I knew a wealthy Jew in New York who owned a furniture polish factory. He was named Mark Jackson, born in Ireland, lived in London a number of years, and this company was called Jackson of London. And we were having dinner together one day. He says, "Brother Jackson," he says, "these Zionist Jews are giving me hell." I says, "Why?" He says, "Well, I think Zionism is a racket, and they know I've got money, and I wouldn't contribute a dime to it. So they've got me in the doghouse." And he told me, he says, the proof that Zionism is a racket is that 50 years ago, or a little over 50 years ago, the Zionists could have bought all the land they wanted down in Brazil for almost nothing per acre, and they could set up that Jewish state down there and nobody would have bothered them. They went back to Palestine and set up that state in a land where the soil is so poor until you can't even grow weeds on it. And if it weren't for the rich Jews in America, Israel wouldn't even survive. And it's in very bad financial condition now. So that you have a situation like that. Now, the original Jews were black, and the Jews boast that they produced the greatest philosopher in the world, Spinoza, who lived in Holland in the 17th century. Spinoza was of Spanish and Portuguese ancestry. I think his Portuguese ancestry. And one of his neighbors described him as a man with a black complexion and curly hair. So the great Jewish philosopher was a black Jew.
Okay.
What?
What about the Greeks? The early Greeks, the ancient.
Oh, they had a strong mixture of African blood. Everybody did, because since the human race came from Africa, according to law in this country, if you have just a small amount of African blood, that makes you a Negro. Well, if you take that literally, then even Reagan is a Negro, because if you trace his ancestry back far enough, you go to Africa. So even Reagan has African blood.
I'd like to first of all thank you for being here as sort of one of our elder statesmen and elder scholars, and thank you for coming to Lausanne and sharing your time and energy with us. The question I have for you is something that struck me in your introductory comments when you say that people like Arthur Schomburg and J.A. Rogers and people like that were your mentors.
That's right.
And I'm wondering, through the 60 some odd years of your career as a scholar, what has been the most encouraging development in terms of black people becoming more in tune with our history?
Well, the most encouraging development I had was when I stood on street corners at night in Harlem and heard Dr. Hubert H. Harrison lecture. And then I would sometimes go to the YMCA, he'd be lecturing there, and sometimes to the library, and sometimes he stood on the steps of the sub-treasury on Wall Street right opposite J.P. Morgan's office. Morgan was probably at the window listening to him. And Harrison gave a lecture down there on Wall Street one day, and the police had to rope off the street because he was lecturing to an audience of 11,000 people. Now here was an unusual black man who fought for the freedom of everybody. He left the Socialist Party because the white socialists were racist. He joined the Garvey movement because he said that the socialists said class first and they practiced race first. And Garvey advocated race first, and that's what he believed in. So he said, I don't believe in class first, I believe in race first. So he joined the Garvey movement. And Harrison was a man, he didn't get into history because he didn't allow white people to flatter him. You have a lot of our people, if a big white man gets up and says some nice words about him, they're tickled to death. So Harrison went to a white YMCA in Brooklyn, New York, and the secretary got up and says, Dr. Harrison is a great scholar. He has a black face, but his heart is white. So Harrison banged his fist on the rostrum. Sir, I demand a retraction. I'll have you understand that my heart is just as black as my face. And Harrison, to show you what a great education he was, he would be lecturing in a library in Harlem on 135th Street, and half of the audience would be students from Columbia University taking notes, because they were getting more from Harrison than they were from the professors up at the university. So Harrison gave a lecture, I think it was at a library, either the library or the YMCA one night. I wasn't there, but some of the people who heard the thing told me the story. Harrison was giving one of his scholarly lectures, and a young man was sitting in the audience, and when he got through, he asked Harrison a silly question, and Harrison gave him a silly answer. The young man lost his temper. Now see here, Dr. Harrison, you are not talking to a fool. I am a highly educated young man. I finished Harvard last year. Harrison says, I beg to differ, young man. You did not finish Harvard because Harvard is still there. He says, you didn't say what you meant to say. You told us tonight that you finished Harvard on commencement day. He says, now the day you finish school is called commencement day. Are you trying to tell us that you finished on commencement day? Well, of course, the young man blew his top and walked out of the meeting. He wasn't going to stand for that sort of thing. So another night, he's on a street corner on 7th Avenue. I think it was 7th Avenue and 135th Street. And a young white man walked into the meeting. Harrison would generally have anywhere from 100 to 300 people standing around while he talked. This white man comes in, and Harrison was lecturing on evolution. And he was telling about how the human race evolved from apes in Africa more than 1 million years ago. Therefore, we are the original race. And this white man waited for the question period. Dr. Harrison, you say that the first men were black and they evolved from apes in Africa. Is that the reason why black people look more like apes than white people do? Harrison says, you've got it entirely wrong, young man. White people look much more like apes than we do. He says, and I'm not asking you to go to a library and do research. All I want you to do is to use your eyes. Go to a zoo and go to the cages where they have the apes. He says, and you won't find one black ape there. All the apes have fair complexions. They have thin lips. They have Anglo-Saxon noses, and they have straight hair. So if you want to get somebody that looks like an ape, get a white man.
I have another question if I might step up, because apparently when you speak, the earth moves. The question I have for you is, do you have any ideas on approaches that progressive African people need to take in order to get our youth more interested in their history? Because, as you said, our people don't read anymore. And if our people are not reading, they're not getting information that gives them a sense of value of who they are. And I'd just like to know what your opinion on that subject would be.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Because there's only one way they can do it, and if they do it, we're not going to be around very long. In other words, any group of people, if they're going to survive, they have to have an economic foundation. There's a block in Chicago where there are 7 storefront churches on one side of the street and 8 storefront churches on the other side of the street. And if you go into the average black neighborhood in a big city, you'll see a storefront church, a saloon, a liquor store, a gambling joint, no business enterprise that's bringing any money into the community. Now, the only way we're going to beat this is to get the young people to organize into cooperative societies. If you need $1 million to go into business, try to get together a large number of people, and each one of them puts up a few dollars, and you put it all together, and you've got enough money to go into business. I'm a member of a cooperative food market in Chicago. We have 11,000 members. Each member owns at least one share in the business. That's $10. We have a credit union, our own bank. Some of the people have thousands of dollars invested in the business, and it pays 6% interest, so that's just as good as putting it in the bank. Now here's 11,000 people. They and their families buy their groceries at this store. It's a big building, takes up nearly a whole block, like an old-fashioned railroad station. We draw interest on our shares. We get good food at a reasonable price, and we give a lot of jobs to young people. Now, if you want to survive, you form cooperative societies, pool together whatever your money you can get, go into business for yourself, and then see to it that you educate yourself. And that means you've got to learn to read. You're not going to get it on television and radio. I remember Hubert Harrison gave a lecture to young people, and he says, I advise all young people who can afford it to go to college. He says, I know a college education is expensive, and some of you can't afford to go to college. But if you can't go to college, get knowledge anyway. You say you can study in libraries, you can buy books, you can teach yourself. And he says that a reading people is a rising people. If you read enough, you will rise. But you've got to have an economic foundation, and the only way you're going to do it, you talk about young people being unemployed, nobody's going to give them jobs. They've got to set up their own businesses and create their own jobs. And if we don't do that, there may not be any of us around when the next century starts.
Brother in the back.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on the Africans' contribution to Christianity, please?
Oh, yes. The Africans created Christianity. If you will read, I have a little article here that I copied from a book by Dr. Albert Churchward called Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man. It's an article on Horus and Jesus. Horus was the black Christ of ancient Egypt, and Jesus was the black Christ of the Christians. Now the Christians have been so badly educated until they think that Jesus Christ was white. But if he was born in the vicinity of Nazareth or Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, he could not have been white because white people didn't live in that territory. Now here's what Dr. Churchward says about comparing the life of Horus as recorded in the Book of the Dead of ancient Egypt and the life of Jesus as recorded in the New Testament. Horus had two mothers, Isis the virgin who conceived him, and Nephthys who nursed him. He was brought forth singly as one of 5 brothers. Jesus had two mothers, Mary the virgin who conceived him, and Mary the wife of Cleophas, who brought him forth as one of her children. He was brought forth singly as one of 5 brethren. Horus was the son of Seb, his father on earth. Jesus was the son of Joseph, his father on earth. Horus was with his mother the virgin until 12 years old, when he was transformed into the beloved Son of God as the only begotten of the Father in heaven. Jesus remained with his mother, the virgin, up to the age of 12 years, when he left her to be about his Father's business.